Good evening, YouTube. It was popular a few years ago to answer some common questions from theist to atheist. And while these have been answered an uncounted number of times, I do think there's actually a personal benefit in it. The honest questions, anyway, not the gotcha ones. Good questions can help me clarify my point of view and share what I actually think with others. So I'm going over a list of 10 questions that was on Reddit about 3 years ago. I'll put a link in the description box. I've also added 2 more questions that I've had or I've seen come up occasionally in conversations that I think kind of go with this question list and are also important to answer. My personal answers are not in any way fantastically original and are very similar to many others, but they are my honest answers. Question 1. How did I become an atheist? My original video was starting to answer this question. The short story is that when I figured out that not only did I not have any evidence for the biblical God or any other gods that I heard about, that I kind of wandered into a spirituality. I explored that for a while and took a deep look at it and realized that didn't have any evidence to back it up either. So, atheist. Now, the journey itself took almost 20 years, but that's the short answer. Question 2. What happens when we die? We no longer exist. That which makes us the person we are is our brain. So when our brain stops functioning, we stop existing. To me, this means we should use every moment of time to our utmost. We have one shot to love our family, make a difference to those around us, and enjoy the world. Question 3. What if you're wrong, and there is a God and an afterlife? I'll be honest, Pascal's wager is the argument for God that drives me the most crazy. Part of that is I actually remember using it in my 20s to justify my beliefs without really understanding just how flawed the wager is. Pascal's wager assumes that there are only 2 options: no God or the specific God presented. But that's not right. The real wager encompasses no God, the Jewish God, any number of different Christian gods, the Muslim God, Egyptian gods, Norse gods, Greco-Roman gods, Hindu gods, Aztec gods, Native American gods, etc., so on and so forth, ad infinitum. So if I die and I'm wrong, the answer to the question would likely depend on which God actually turns out to exist. I hope I would have the moral courage to stick to my guns and demand to know how I was supposed to tell which one was real. Where was the evidence, and why didn't that God make it more obvious? If whatever God actually exists doesn't understand honest skepticism, well, then it isn't a very moral God, and I'm likely screwed. And of course, there is the reverse question to the theist who asked the question. What if you picked the wrong God? How do you know you're right about God? Question 4. Without God, where do you get your morality from? The snarky answer is the same place you do. The better answer is from my empathy and realizing that my actions affect other people, and that conversely, how I act affects my place in society and how other people treat me. If the question is actually asking how did morality develop in the human species, then the answer to that is complicated and involves the fields of evolution, biology, sociology, psychology, all sorts of places. The fact is that for social species like humans, actions that are based on empathy and altruism, depending on the action, can improve the overall likelihood of the survival of our species, if not the individual. I've put a link below to a Wikipedia article about the evolution of morality. Now, I absolutely understand Wiki is a weak source, but the article is a good starting point and it has great links to lots of interesting articles and videos about the evolution of morality. It's a good jumping off point. I can absolutely see why people are studying this area and finding it interesting enough to spend tons of time and effort figuring out. Yes, if you haven't figured it out yet, I'm a geek. I like learning new things. What can I say? Question 5. If there is no God, can we do what we want? Are we free to murder and rape? Well, good deeds are unrewarded. No, we aren't. Not if we want to live in a stable society where we don't need to be in constant terror of rape and death, where we're not constantly, 100% of the times, looking over our shoulder with a knife in our hands to defend ourselves. But how does believing in God stop rape and murder? God doesn't seem to be stopping any of his followers from killing and raping whenever they want, both right now, today, and historically. Instead, what seems to help stabilize society, based on history and studies, is a good government that includes a decent police force, a good educational system, well-distributed resources, and a society that is teaching the value of human life. An important part of that society's health depends on how it's negotiated and agreed on moral values that promote both the well-being of society and the individual. You got to kind of balance both. I'm including a few charts to show that we are, as a species, getting less violent to support this idea. The first slide compares societies that had governments versus those that didn't historically. The homicide rate is dramatically different, and that's just a government. It's not comparing republic or democratic governments with theocratic versus secular versus communist, just looking at governments. The second and third slide shows how the homicide rate has been slowly decreasing in several European countries over centuries at the same time as education and literacy rates have increased. The fourth and fifth slides show how even the deaths in wars have decreased since 1946, even as our ability to exponentially kill more people has increased. This doesn't mean this trend will always continue, it's just interesting. The last slide shows literacy rates across the world by age group. On this slide, you'll see a conclusion. I have a caveat to that conclusion. Literacy rates will only continue to help decrease violence if we continue to teach that humans are all humans and that we should enjoy the same basic human rights. This is a personal opinion, but I think it's borne out a little bit by history that a society, even with a high literacy rate, could be made immoral with the right kind of brainwashing and leadership. Could happen in both a secular or in a theocratic society. It's all about the leaders and people stopping their questions. And it's important, so that we don't get these societies, that we continue the conversation about what our best answers are to hard moral questions. And we keep evaluating both the questions and the answers. Are humans perfect? No, not in any sense of the word, but we are improving. And I hope and believe that we will continue to do so. To the last part of this question posed by the unknown theist, I ask in return, do good deeds require a reward beyond hopefully a thank you and or seeing the results of my actions? And to be honest, I'm personally glad that I don't have to think that the use is somehow karmically or cosmically fair. No human being has ever earned cancer. Additionally, why should I need the carrot of heaven to encourage me to help others? And if I'm doing it for a heavenly reward, is it truly a good deed? Question 6. If there is no God, how does your life have any meaning? I'll be honest, I've never entirely understood where this question comes from. How does a God provide any meaning? I could see how a God might provide you with a purpose, spreading his word, but providing a meaning never clicked with me. I personally find meaning by enjoying my family and friends, in my excitement in learning new things, in reading new stories, sometimes in my job, often in my amazing coworkers, and exploring the world. Question 7. Where did the universe come from? Sorry, I don't have a clue. I'm afraid I didn't understand physics beyond the basics in either high school or college, and I've never studied cosmology. If I understand the explanations out there written for lay people, the answer is that science has some hypotheses, but we don't yet and may not ever have the full answer. Or there's even the suggestion that the question itself is wrong or flawed in some manner. As far as I can tell, scientists are continuing to study and learn, which makes this an exciting field open for discovery. And before someone says, oh, you just have faith in science. No, I don't have faith. I have a skeptical trust in the scientific method, and that the belief that the majority of scientists are human beings with egos, and some of them want to go down in history by changing the world. Scientists don't get famous by confirming what has already been shown in hypotheses and theories. They get famous by discovering something new or overturning something old. I work in the veterinary field, and I watched in the last 10 years medical ideas changing. Not all of them, but small ones here and there. I was at a lecture in the last couple of years where a lecturer stood up and said, "I was wrong. Our old studies had incomplete data. Here's what we've learned in the new studies." Think about how amazing and brave that was. But this lecture wasn't lampooned. They were respected for showing that they had learned something new. They had done studies that overturned wrong evidence. No, not all scientists are that honest, but many are. And when the scientists that aren't honest are shown to be wrong or lying, it's usually other scientists pointing it out. So with some mild caveats, overall, I trust the scientific process to a high degree, always knowing that new evidence may overturn old. Since this was a list of questions written for atheists by theists, I'm also going to point out that just because I and science don't apparently have the complete answer right now, doesn't mean God did it. To get that answer, you need to show evidence of God and of God creating the universe. You can't just point to a gap in our knowledge and drop God in there. Question 8. What about miracles? What about all the people who claim to have a connection with Jesus? What about those who claim to have seen saints and angels? Maybe they did see those things, but personal experience alone is not evidence of anything. What about all the people who are living today who claim to have been abducted by aliens or seen the Loch Ness Monster or attest to the healing power of crystals? Should I believe them as well? Is it possible those people who claim to have a connection with Jesus or seen angels have felt or seen something? Absolutely. But how are we to determine what they have observed is real and from a source they assume it's from? And how do we determine reality from a hallucination, a seizure, or a chemical reaction in our brains? To the specific point of miracles, for me to believe in a miracle, I would need to see the miracle documented in detail, with the only explanation available being something supernatural. Even then, you'd have to tie it to a specific miracle to a specific God. That's hard to do. How do we know that that specific God did it? How do we know it wasn't a trickster God, or a different God, or Satan, or an alien who thought it would be funny? Do I think miracles happen? No. I could be convinced with evidence. I've just never been presented with any. Question 9. What's your view of Dawkins, Hitchens, and Harris? They're educated men who have strong opinions about religion, but I don't actually know a lot about any of them. If by that question it was meant, did they influence me on my road to atheism? No, they didn't. I still haven't read Dawkins' The God Delusion. I've watched old interviews of all of them, and I agree with some of the issues they have about religion and other things, but not everything. Do I think they are good at starting much needed conversations? Absolutely. It's the best thing about them being well known. If you meant, do I take their every word as some kind of be-all and end-all of atheism? No, absolutely not. They are well-educated, fallible human beings who could be wrong and could be right. Question 10. If there is no God, then why does every society have a religion? Actually, the Piraha, sorry if I butchered the pronunciation, have no God or organized religion. So not all societies have religion. But yes, we do appear to have some evolutionary traits that make us more likely to believe in supernatural things. It's probably the result of a need to keep an eye out for subtle signs of things out to get you. It's safer to assume that a tiny noise in a corner is a monster out to eat you than not to assume that and be wrong. Religion may also have been a useful way to hold tribal groups together, so that may have been selected as an evolutionary advantage. However, that's not proof of God, it's proof of evolutionary advantages that may have helped us come to be the dominant species on the planet. That's the end of the Reddit questions, but there are a few more I've run across that this seems like a good time to answer. So question 11. If it could be proved that God exists, would you believe? Yes. If you could provide proof that any of the gods humans have proposed, or one that we have not yet proposed, exists, I would believe. However, I suspect what people actually mean when they ask this question is, would you worship that God? And that's going to depend on the God. Any of the Abrahamic gods, the answer would be yes, but not out of respect or love, but out of complete and utter terror. The God of the Torah, the Bible, and the Quran is a description of evil. If there was evidence that this God existed, I would try to worship and dull my mind so that I would not, and my family would not, be injured. But since that God is described as maximally great or all-knowing, I suspect he would know I worship out of terror, not love. So I'd likely end up in his hell either way. I know a lot of atheists that claim that they would not worship and that they would fight, and maybe they would. But based on what happens in totalitarian regimes like North Korea, I'm guessing not as many people would fight back because they would not want to put their families at risk or themselves. And I strongly suspect I would be one of those. Although I'd love to think of myself as a person who would be out looking for the God-slaying sword, statistically speaking, and honestly, I probably wouldn't be. Question 12. What kind of evidence would you need for proof of God? The first time I heard this question, my off-the-cuff answer was for all childhood cancer to instantly disappear across the world and for no child to ever get cancer again. And while that would be amazing, and that answer worked for me for a while, somebody pointed out the flaws. If this event occurred, how would I know which God did it? How would I even determine it was a God and not some kind of benevolent alien race? Or Satan working as a trickster? How would I know who did it? So now I've stolen my answers from other atheists. I don't know what it would take me to be convinced of a particular God. But if the God described is even maximally knowing or all-knowing, he, she, or it should know how to convince me. And those are my answers to 12 questions. I'm sure there's lots more questions out there, but that felt like a good jumping off point for me. Thanks for listening.